Fox and Studio Canal's War of the Worlds is absolutely terrible. In terms of it being an adaptation of the War of the Worlds, well, it simply isn't an adaptation. If it is an adaptation, it could easily be considered the worst adaptation of the War of the Worlds that I've ever seen, and that's saying something considering I've seen the BBC's version. I said with the BBC's one that they didn't seem to be interested in telling the story of the War of the Worlds. They just wanted to tell their own story and have the War of the Worlds going on in the background. Well, Fox's adaptation, I keep calling it Fox's adaptation, but I'm just shortening it to that because saying Fox and Studio Canal's adaptation is quite long. But also some people refer to it as the Epix version, so whatever it is, that's what I mean when I say Fox. I'm not necessarily putting the blame all on Fox, I just can't be bothered to say Fox, Studio Canal and Epix every time. Fox's one has the same problem as the BBC one, I think, but arguably even worse, because while they called it War of the Worlds, to me it felt like they didn't actually make any effort to tell the story of the War of the Worlds, and much like the BBC one, simply used the name to get people to watch it. But at least with the BBC one, which I thought was utterly terrible by the way, at least it had the story of the War of the Worlds going on in the background. Fox's version didn't even bother doing that. They didn't even have the tripods. How can you make War of the Worlds without the tripods? Now I know the 50s version had flying fighting machines instead, but they technically were tripods, they just had invisible legs, which out of the universe was purely down to the limitations in effects at the time. They had trouble filming them with physical legs, so instead they showed them flying. But they said in the film that they had invisible energy legs or something like that, which they actually went to the effort of showing in at least one scene if I recall correctly. Whereas Fox's version didn't have the tripods by choice. The tripods are arguably, at least visually, the most iconic element of the War of the Worlds. If you had to picture the War of the Worlds, most people would likely think of the tripods. Making a so-called adaptation of the War of the Worlds and not having the tripods is like making Doctor Who and not having the Daleks. Except even worse, because at least with Doctor Who, if you didn't have the Daleks, you'd still have the Doctor and the TARDIS, recognisable elements specific to Doctor Who. I think pretty much every adaptation of the War of the Worlds has had a different protagonist, so it doesn't even have that type of similar element to keep this show in the realm of the War of the Worlds. So basically, I'm convinced that Fox's War of the Worlds is called War of the Worlds simply to get more people to watch it, in an even worse abuse of the intellectual property than what the BBC did. Don't get me wrong, I think both the Fox version as well as the BBC version awfully used the identity of the War of the Worlds in order to get more viewers. But whereas I think the BBC said, we want to tell a romantic, boring Edwardian story, but let's call it War of the Worlds and put the War of the Worlds in the background. Fox said, we want to tell a generic sci-fi story, but let's call it War of the Worlds without it actually being remotely anything to do with the War of the Worlds. I do believe it's okay to change a story when adapting it, but then there comes the point when you can change it too much to the point it isn't anything to do with what you're supposedly adapting anymore, and essentially isn't an adaptation at all. It's its own thing and might as well be considered as such. Fox's adaptation seems to think that a generic end of the world invaded by aliens story is enough of a connection to call it an adaptation of War of the Worlds. They evidently made a hasty study of the War of the Worlds, and it was there that their knowledge ended. If I didn't know the title, I could see just a promotional shot of the BBC's version and I'd know what it was meant to be. If I didn't know the title and watched the entire series of Fox's War of the Worlds, I wouldn't have thought it was an adaptation of the War of the Worlds. That's the difference between the two, I think. So they don't have the tripods, instead they have literally those robot dog things the military uses. If you haven't seen them, on YouTube just look up military robot dog and there's tons of videos of them. Who knew alien invaders got their weapons of mass destruction from Boston Dynamics? Then again, mass destruction, Boston, Massachusetts, whatever. In one episode, a French soldier even kicks one in exactly the same manner, as they almost always get kicked in the YouTube videos to show how sturdy they are. The strength of the dogs in the show is confusing as well. They're shown to have pinpoint accuracy when firing their sniper-like guns, except when the plot dictates that they shouldn't, of course, such as when it's a main character that's running away from them. They manage to kill near enough everyone in a military government base full of soldiers in one episode, and then two of the main cast, a man and a woman, turn up at this base, and the man accidentally opens the door one of the robots was trapped behind. But it's okay, because the woman, who has presumably never had firearm training before, unless that was like a throwaway line I missed or something, just grabs a gun and instantly shoots the robot dead as if it's nothing. In fact, that was also, if I recall correctly, the first scene in which the robots were seen clearly and up close, which didn't exactly make them appear to be much of a threat, which is why it was confusing how these things had overrun run a military base full of armed trained soldiers when two random civilians can come along not expecting anything. They've never seen these robot things before, they didn't know they even existed, and they just grab a gun and shoot one as if it's nothing and it dies instantly. You'd think its metal armour would protect it from bullets, but apparently not. I think this is pretty much the only time one dies like this though. Everyone seems to have guns in this series, yet they always run away or hide from these things as if the guns do nothing, when in their first major encounter with one it ends up getting shot to death very easily. Maybe she just got lucky and hit a vital component. In fact, in other episodes the soldiers are shooting them and it's like the bullets are doing nothing. It's really confusing. In terms of the show itself, as in not thinking of it as being a supposed adaptation of the War of the Worlds, it's hard to go into detail with it because it's got such a large cast spread out. It seems to be all over the place in terms of story. The main characters are at different places doing different things. There's loads of different storylines that are going on throughout the show. Let me point out that I was terrified of watching this show because I found the BBC's adaptation incredibly boring for the most part, but at least that one ended after 3 episodes. I hadn't looked into the Fox one beforehand, but I hadn't heard good things about it. But I did know that it was a proper series of quite a few episodes, and the first 15 minutes of the first episode utterly terrified me. Not because it was scary in any way, but simply because it was extremely boring, and I was thinking, oh gosh, there's like 8 episodes of this show. There's like a 5-minute scene of 2 French people in some observatory in the Alps or something, and saying all this techno babble that was just utterly pointless. They were like, I'm picking up a signal, but this is impossible. Are you sure it isn't a problem with this scanner? No, it isn't. I can't work out where it is coming from. Have you tried oscillating the parameters of the decimeter? Yes, it doesn't show anything. It just shows the repeating mechanism that the diametron is picking with X-Squalium effects. It's literally like that for like 5 minutes, but it feels like 10. All they need to do is say, oh look, we've picked up a weird thing on the radar. Next scene. Oh, I almost forgot to mention, they say all this in French, so it's in subtitles, because the show is a half French, half American production between Fox and Studio Canal. So anyway, they pick up this signal, and shortly after, the meteors or whatever fall down from the sky in a 20-second or so scene that is the only imagery that is remotely reminiscent of the War of the Worlds in the entire series. The woman that picked up the signal was the character that annoyed me the most because she was just a bloody liability. Just before the meteors came, she phoned her sister and told her to get up to the Alps Observatory where it'd be safe because she knew something bad was going to happen. Honestly, it surprised me that her sister just happened to be within driving distance of the base, but whatever. The meteors fall and her sister doesn't make it in time. And the observatory woman spends the entire series, up to like episode 6 or 7, looking for her. In the process of doing this, she gets so many people killed and is just an utterly useless character. There's an army at the base and the head of the army is always defending her, and it annoys me because she keeps running off the base wandering about the woods trying to find her sister, and the army has to keep coming to find her, and in the process a lot of soldiers get killed. In one episode she finds a young girl alone in the woods who's lost her parents, and then the army find her and say, we need to get back to the base, it's not safe here. And then a woman's like, no, I have to find my sister, and reluctantly the army guy agrees, and they go searching until eventually the army guy forces them to return to the base after some of the soldiers get killed by the robot dogs, as well as the young girl. It's like she could have said, ah yes, but I found this girl, so let's take her back to the base, and then I want to look for my sister. But no, because of her utter idiocy and selfishness, the young girl, along with many other people, get killed. I think when I got back to the base, eventually the army guy is like, don't worry, it wasn't your fault those people died, and I was thinking, why are you telling her that? It absolutely was her fault. In fact, in one episode, she even says something like, oh, this whole invasion is all my fault. I sent the signal that we received some music and that let them know where Earth was. So like literally every death in this show is her fault. Plus, whenever they go out searching for her sister, I notice she just wanders about with the soldiers, not even carrying a gun or anything. I mean, to be fair, with a gun she'd probably be an even bigger liability, but she was just an absolutely useless character. She didn't seem to even try to help. Just to clarify, I think I said in my BBC War of Worlds review that I find it hard and don't like criticising acting, so when I say all this, please note I'm criticising the characters and not necessarily the actors and actresses. The thing that really made me realise how awful this series is its ongoing mysteries. It shows bad storytelling, I think anyway, when you can't just be satisfied with doing a story about aliens invading the world. You have to put in all these, oh, why is this happening? Moments into it as well to try to keep the viewer interested. So basically one of the main characters is a blind girl, but after the aliens invade, for some reason she occasionally starts to be able to see again on and off. Meanwhile, she keeps having visions of being in bed with another character she's never met, a 15-year-old French boy in France, who just happens to be travelling with the girl's dad, who's trying to get back to his family, who are in Britain. The French boy, who I quite liked actually, because I found him funny because he was an absolute nutter, likewise keeps having visions of the girl and finds a photograph of her in her dad's bag, and he steals the photograph, and her dad is well annoyed with this and they fight and whatever. The girl and the boy also just happen to be the only people apparently that robot dogs aren't interested in. They just ignore them for some reason. And the girl keeps trying to touch one, which is weird, and then keeps getting angry at people for shooting at them, as if the dogs also aren't interested in killing everyone else too. Also, the robot dogs steal babies. How about that? That's the thing, this show's just a generic Fox show where its purpose is to get viewers and keep viewers hooked. The story doesn't matter. They're not trying to tell a story. It's television at its most commercially formulaic, if that's the right term. The gaming equivalent is like, for example, the Black Ops series of Call of Duty. First one, great, terrific story. Second one, amazing, brilliant story. But there wasn't really anywhere they could go with it after that. The story was done, it had been concluded. But it made money, so out comes Black Ops 3 and Black Ops 4, both of which used the Black Ops name and tried to recreate the formula and failed massively in comparison, at least in terms of story. It had nothing to do with the original Black Ops story, it was using the name for success, and in my opinion it's a taint on the franchise. Because all they're interested in is making money by creating formulaic products and abusing brands. That's why this War of the Worlds series is so bad. It has way too many stupid mysteries in order to keep the viewer watching to find out the answer to the mysteries. It doesn't even resolve any of the mysteries, it plods throughout the series by the final episode, as far as I can recall anyway. Now, it wouldn't make any sense to unveil all of the mysteries, because in October they announced that they are already working on a second series, which it got released initially in October in France, so I kind of think they jumped the gun a bit on that, like at least wait for the reception of the first series. But not even one mystery getting resolved by the final episode is a bit like, well, that wasn't worth watching, and personally I don't think I'll choose to watch the second series. The ending of the final episode was what really puts the nail in the coffin, in my opinion anyway. I won't go into specifics, but it ends with yet another stupid mystery, as opposed to resolving any of the ones that are already looming, in order to try to keep the audience hanging on till the next series. Like, it wasn't even one of those things where it's like it answers something, but the answer provides more questions. This was just, let's purely provide more questions. It expects so much from the viewer without giving anything in reward. It's very poorly done in that regard, I'd say. Now, earlier I criticised the show for using the name War of the Worlds when it can hardly be called an adaption, and I've read an interview with the director Richard Clarke, and he says, we can argue until the cows come home about whether calling it War of the Worlds was wise or not. You do wish upsetting people. Where are the tripods? Where are the lasers, etc.? But it's better to be bold than to try to please everybody. Drama should involve and invent and explore. It was a shame they weren't bold enough to invent something entirely new instead of using a known title to get people to watch it. He continues, we can't pretend to be something we're not. Well, why did you then? You pretended to be War of the Worlds and you're not. Now, he actually predicts a lot of the criticism that I said previously. He said people watching the show have got to settle into a different rhythm. If you're too used to that constant kinetic instant gratification, this is probably going to piss you off, because you've got to have patience with it. Now, I'm a pretty patient person, I think anyway, and I understand the balance that a show needs in terms of patience. I think a lot of people don't have patience for shows, and I find that a great shame, because there's a lot of shows out there that get disregarded, but are actually brilliant when people give them more of a go. But you know, I mentioned it earlier that this show doesn't have that balance, where it's like, if you tune in next week it'll be worth it. None of the mysteries it sets up pay off in the first series, and it slaps you in the face at the end by providing even bigger mysteries with an arguably pretentious cliffhanger. He also says, there is a danger you set up expectations that you don't deliver, but I think there's always a danger of that. If you go into a free Michelin star restaurant and you came in looking for a burger, you're going to be disappointed. A more appropriate analogy, I would argue, would be going into a free Michelin star restaurant with a sign above it reading McDonald's, looking for a burger and then being disappointed. I feel like I'm being really mean, but I'm just responding to the points. I'm being harsh, because they're acting like they're being bold by doing something different, when if they were actually being bold, they would have created an entirely new show and not attempted to make it out like it was an adaptation of the War of the Worlds. Like, I wish he'd gone with what he was saying. I wish they had been bold. so I'm criticising them for failing to do that. It would have even been different if they'd called it War of the Worlds but made it clear it wasn't an adaptation. It has nothing to do with the book, it just happens to have a similar title. But they didn't, they specifically said it was an adaptation of the War of the Worlds. They should have just had the balls to create something entirely new, but they didn't, but they're acting like they did, and that's why I'm disappointed and I'm being harsh as a result, because I like boldness. I think more people should be bold. Obviously, as it happens, I don't personally know H.G. Wells. It was a bit before my time, which probably seems quite surprising. But I don't think he would have appreciated what they call their boldness in creating an adaptation as loose as this one. I could be wrong, of course. I don't really even know that much about him compared to a lot of people. But I did read that when the first ever editions of the War of the Worlds that were illustrated were released, Wells was incredibly displeased with the drawings of the tripods that had been done by the artist, Warwick Goebel, to the point that in later releases he added in text stating that the artist had evidently made a hasty study of one of the fighting machines and it was there that his knowledge ended. Now, I've been very critical of the show, but here's the part where I struggle to find good things about the adaptation to talk about. I'm joking, but you know, I guess the CGI for Robot Dogs was quite good, arguably. The kid that played the Nutty French Kid was good at playing a Nutty French Kid. The BBC one was very pretentious and shoving its political ideas down the throats of the viewers, and this one wasn't like that, I'd say. According to Clark, the director, this is less political with a big P and more a question of what it is to be human. It starts to allude to the nature of war and moral questions about when we fight, why we fight, what's justified about when we fight, and how we need to demonise our enemy in order to do what we need to do, which personally didn't bother me, whereas the BBC one really pissed me off with the utter pretentious rubbish it was spewing, without an ounce of subtlety. You know, this one, if what the director said there is anything to go by, it's about asking questions, although maybe the series had too much of asking questions in terms of the story, whereas the BBC one was about giving you the answers that you didn't ask for. Actually, I remember at the end of my review of the BBC one, I mentioned that the French and the Americans were also doing an adaptation of War of the Worlds. I jokingly said, wait, oh bloody hell, the Americans and the French have made an adaptation of War of the Worlds as well? Was this one going to be a commentary on social justice or something? But there wasn't any really, so I appreciate that. The BBC one made me hate it because of how up its own arse it was, whereas the Fox one, I just didn't like that they called it War of the Worlds, and plus it was simply boring. I saw someone say they should have called it Snore of the Worlds. I've seen people say the BBC version is better than the Fox one, and I've seen people say the Fox one is better than the BBC version. But which one is better? There's only one way to find out. Fight! Okay, no, I'm joking. When comparing two things, there's always someone that says, guys, they're both good in their own ways. Well, these two series are both bad in their own ways. Honestly, it's a really tight call in my opinion. Personally though, for me, I think the BBC one is better in terms of being an adaptation. It actually looked like the War of the Worlds when it could be bothered to try to look like War of the Worlds. But I think the Fox one is better as a show in general. Sure, it's boring, but so was the BBC one. Except at least the Fox adaptation has the excuse of being able to say, we had to stretch it over 8 episodes and into a second series. The fact that the BBC managed to make their version of just 3 episodes equally, if not more, boring is almost impressive. Ultimately, it doesn't matter which is worse, it's purely a matter of opinion, and they're both terrible in my opinion anyway. If you enjoyed any of them, fair enough, I'm just saying my personal opinions, as always. I'm not saying, oh, you should hate this show, I'm just saying what I thought of it. Also, side note, one of the main cast was David Tennant's son, Ty Tennant, and within like the 2nd episode they had a scene where it's like, we need to find a doctor, or something like that, and I just knew that they were going to make a reference like that. As always, all my criticisms are mainly directed at the creative direction of the show. You know, there's a lot of people that worked hard on this and did good work and are proud of it, so you know, I'm not having a go at them or whatever, it's just the overall direction of the show as a whole. So yeah, that's basically my opinion on Fox and Studio Canal's War of the Worlds. In terms of it being an adaptation, well, it simply wasn't one, so in that respect it was terrible as an adaptation. In terms of it as a show in its own right, it was simply boring and focused too much on trying to keep the viewer invested by providing too many mysteries without rewarding them for sticking around by resolving any. You have to do give and take when you play that game, and this show takes but doesn't seem to give, even when you think it's about to. Wait, oh bloody hell, the Australians have made an adaptation of War of the Worlds as well? Okay, no they haven't, I'm joking about that one.